DLC, downloadable content, everyone loves it, everyone wants it. You spend $70 on a brand new game only for it to have multiple times that amount in paid DLC. Or hey, maybe you pre-ordered the game and got those sweet bonuses like an alternate weapon skin you'll forget an hour into the game. DLC can be fine if it offers a baseline of quality and content, but what about when the money you spend just gets you a few short missions and that's it? Most games still have season passes, but there was a definite point in the Xbox One/PS4 and 360 PS3 generation where the main thrust of DLC was small expansions to larger games that added new weapons, new enemies, new assets. Think back to Arkham Knight, Evil Within, Alien Isolation, Watch Dogs, even Borderlands 2, which was a bit earlier. Yet many of these DLCs were short-lived. They may offer new gameplay, new weapons, or special powers, but rarely did they offer the same quality of single-player experience and polish as the main games people fell in love with, and even rarer did they offer much playtime to match. Despite often padding the re-released definitive editions of games that couldn't get away with calling themselves a Game of the Year edition, rarely did these DLCs feel essential to the base game instead of random extensions. I think back to single-player, linear DLC like those found in Arkham Knight, which seldom seemed to last longer than 15 minutes, or the extra level in Force Unleashed 2, which was a repetitive and ultra-linear slog. DLC like this seldom adds much to the overall experience. The flaws of linear single-player DLCs aren't necessarily the fault of the developers. Much of the time, DLC is made per agreement with the game's publishers, the money people, and is contractually obligated to be delivered at very specific points. So when a company says they're making single-player DLC, that content is coming hell or high water. It's why a lot of the time these types of DLC would reuse assets like environments, characters, and more in creating new playable areas, or sometimes even reuse those areas. Think of Laura's Nightmare DLC, which reused an explorable Croft Manor in Rise of the Tomb Raider for a Call of Duty zombie-style wave defense mode. This need to balance perceived value for the player with a price tag has led to a lot of replayable DLC, featuring score attack modes, roguelike additions, and others that can use pre-existing assets to give more than just a half hour of single-player gameplay for a paid piece of content. DLC as a whole has taken many forms in the last few decades as publishers have looked to maximize their monetization for games, and once upon a time that led to plenty of games like the aforementioned, along with some hefty season pass price tags. But it seems that over time, the prevalence of single-player DLC that makes for a fresh yet familiar experience has stalled. Don't get me wrong, there is still plenty of expansion-type DLC out there, but it seems like the range of those pieces of content have been limited in the past few years. You can get plenty of DLC mileage out of open-world games, where in terms of assets, you already have much of a world already built. Looking at examples like Assassin's Creed Valhalla, some might say that the base game uses its massive scale to pad its length and playtime, and likewise with the various DLCs. Of course, there are multiplayer games, and with them, the live service style has overtaken much of the traditional season pass space, replacing simple content drops with promises of battle passes, limited time unlocks, and ever-evolving gameplay spaces, all with the intent of keeping players invested, and therefore getting them to invest more money, if not time. In keeping with these kinds of free content drops, single-player games have even had a few of their own, like Resident Evil 2's free Survivor update, though these could hardly be called considerable. But it's rare that we see a campaign-style DLC for single-player games that aren't massive RPGs or open-world Ubisoft games. It's even more rare that when that kind of content appears, it's hefty, with plenty of replayable content, and instead of feeling like content that's been chipped off the main experience to be monetized, helps expand an already satisfying base game to feel more complete. Which brings me to Resident Evil 4: Separate Ways. Coming in at $10, Separate Ways is an add-on to the remake of all-time classic horror game Resident Evil 4. The DLC is a remake of an additional mode featured in the original PS2 release, and much like the main game, Separate Ways recontextualizes its inspirations to keep even longtime fans invested. It's a smartly crafted narrative experience, taking the mysterious fan favorite Ada Wong and giving her more characterization than seen in her modern incarnation in the Resident Evil 2 and 4 remakes. Her personality, with a fantastic and natural voice performance, gets a chance to shine here as she navigates the world around Leon Kennedy. Separate Ways plays like something of a Pulp Fiction-style accompaniment to Leon's European vacation, showing what Ada was doing behind the scenes to impact his journey and help him out. The DLC also further complements the main game by restoring a boss that was missing from the remake and a beloved set piece in the form of the ski lift, among other moments I won't spoil. The gameplay is buttery smooth just like the base game, with Ada leveraging melee combat and lots of busted kneecaps to escape the Ganado horrors. Like many DLCs out there, there are some new gimmicks to keep things fresh, like Ada's grapple gun, which can be used to close the distance between enemies and navigate the environment in new ways. Like the gameplay, the graphical presentation in Separate Ways is still top-notch, especially impressive in the variety of detailed cutscenes. There are minor issues with blurry textures and pop-in, but that's a known issue with Xbox Series S versions, which is my only option to play it on. And after all the opening bits about thin single-player DLC, you may be surprised to know that Separate Ways is also considerable in length, coming in at almost 4 hours for my first playthrough. But like all modern Resident Evil releases, it's incredibly replayable with multiple unlocked difficulties and returning side quests from the RE4 remake to hunt down and complete. With a solid story, great graphics and gameplay, and a considerable playtime, Separate Ways is a rarity in downloadable content, and the fan reaction has attested as much. This is what players imagine when they put down a game and think, I wish there was more to play. It's the same high-quality experience, extended with new thrills and surprises. So, how is it possible that such a big DLC drops less than a year after the initial game? Well, for starters, it's been in development likely longer than that, and was likely at least planned alongside the main campaign if how Leon and Ada's story intertwine is any indication, compared to the PS2 incarnation, which features several lapses and retcons. But more important to me than the development time is how Separate Ways cuts costs usually associated with new content. RE4 didn't need to worry about polishing its stellar gameplay, leaving the team to simply come up with new encounters and challenges for players, which they did. And while there are a few new areas, side offshoots of familiar grounds, bosses, and more, Separate Ways is a marvel for how it reuses assets, something that many players and even developers might initially recoil at hearing. Much of Separate Ways plays like a Resident Evil 4 remix. Ada moves backwards through areas Leon goes forward through. She doesn't follow the same village, castle, island formula Leon does, instead ping-ponging through the region. Nearly every area is reused from Leon's adventure, but is changed somehow for a fresh experience, whether it's due to inclement weather, changes in level design like leveled buildings, or simply different enemy tactics. While there are new bosses, much of the assets here, from characters to environmental details, are entirely reused. And that's something not uncommon in the RE Engine games. Eagle-eyed fans have noticed for years the same assets reused across Resident Evil 7, Remake, 2, 3, Resident Evil Village, and now Resident Evil 4 in Separate Ways. New areas have been created entirely from scratch, of course, but the ability to reuse small environmental assets and details helped to cut down development cost, allowing Capcom to have released top-notch horror games every year or every other year since 2017. It's the small things you might not think about as a casual player, the reused garbage on the ground, scattered debris, books on shelves, and plenty more. Yet this ephemera is essential to presentation. Without these small, seemingly insignificant assets, the areas wouldn't feel as lived in, the world is atmospheric. Asset reuse is a sticky subject because for most gamers, it conjures up an idea of laziness, of needing to meet a deadline so you rush a project using pieces assembled from other projects. An asset flip, for lack of a better term. For those who don't know, an asset flip is mostly referred to a wide variety of indie games on Steam that would be made using beginner-friendly game engines. The games featured generic enemy types and lacked any artistic cohesion between the elements. These games were shoddy, hastily assembled fare that were sold for a pittance, and as a result, rarely garnered any positive feedback. This isn't the case with how Capcom has reused Resident Evil assets. Well, for the most part. It turns out there is a good example of how not to reuse assets, which came in the form of RE-verse, or Reverse, the long-delayed and now forgotten stylized multiplayer shooter. Reverse is a stain on the modern Resident Evil brand, recalling an age of poorly planned and executed titles like the execrable Umbrella Corps. The gameplay is finicky, the netcode buggy, progression non-existent, and the maps are full-scale rips from slow-burn single-player horror games that have been haphazardly retrofitted to be multiplayer shooter maps. So what's the difference between something like RE-verse, which reuses assets for a majority of its content, and Separate Ways? Aside from the obvious being one multiplayer and one not, why is there such a gulf in quality? Real quick, I want to talk about one of my favorite game series, Yakuza. Since blowing up in the West with the excellent Yakuza 0, the Ryuga Gotoku, or as it's now known, Like a Dragon series, has gained rightful acclaim for its wonderful, sprawling crime epic storytelling and polished gameplay. But if you've kept up with the series' variety of remakes, remasters, and new entries, you've probably noticed a lot of reused assets. Like a lot. Entire minigames, stores, areas, weapons, animations, NPCs, and so much more carry over between games, usually divided between which game engine is used. The biggest asset that can be pointed to is the entire map of Kamurocho, Tokyo's red light district where so much of the series takes place or returns to in various entries. Other cities get recycled in Yakuza, but not nearly to the extent that Kamurocho has, and has a massive epic yarn covering more than 50 years of the characters' lives. The way Kamurocho is reused has become my favorite part of Yakuza. Each game will change areas, stores, expand into new streets, or close down others, sometimes based on events in previous games. As fans spend dozens or even hundreds of hours in Kamurocho, they come to know its intricacies, the streets themselves, the nooks and crannies. And when those things are changed, it makes for a suddenly new gameplay experience. As an example, Don Quixote. Throughout the series, spanning decades in storytelling, Don Quixote is a store that you can always easily revisit to pick up items, located in the same southern spot in Kamurocho. Yet in one of the most recent entries, the storefront is gone, replaced by a police station. Suddenly, this area is reminiscent of revisiting an area you used to know that's changed to be something unfamiliar in real life. It's an experience in a game I've never had before, of lost familiarity. And it's only possible because of how many times those assets have been reused. Changed, in slight ways each time, but reused and revisited. So what does that have to do with Separate Ways, or Reverse for that matter? Well, Separate Ways doesn't slightly use some small assets. It's made up almost entirely of other pieces from Resident Evil 4 Remake. Like I mentioned, you get a lot of the same environments remixed with new gameplay encounters and details, and the result isn't just an expansion on the base game, but something that remains cohesive to the whole. Granted, the playbook for this DLC was entirely based in another game on the PS2. They had a guide to follow. But compare this DLC to something like the DLC in Resident Evil 5 or Resident Evil 7, which both feel slight and ephemeral. They're small, bite-sized experiences that may reuse some assets but feel hamstrung by needing to create entirely new areas and gameplay styles. Instead, Separate Ways hedges closer to something like the Rose DLC from Resident Evil Village, which reused a lot of environments and bosses, but recontextualized them and added plenty of new gameplay gimmicks. But even Shadows of Rose, while using plenty of objects and textures from Resident Evil Village, still made entirely new environments and was an overall shorter experience at around 2 hours. Like Kamurocho, this reuse of environments contributes to a sense of lost familiarity. Separate Ways innovates on areas hardcore fans have likely played through half a dozen times by now, helping to create an experience for the player that remains familiar enough to fit with the main game and story, but just distinctive enough to be fresh and exciting as a change of pace. Is this an asset flip? I mean, kinda it is. Probably 80% of the assets in Separate Ways are from other pieces of content, if not from Resident Evil 4. But it's how those assets are used that make it stand out. The reuse of assets also contributes greatly to one of Separate Ways' biggest strengths as a piece of content players pay additional money for, and that's its runtime. This could have easily been a sub-2-hour experience, giving players a truncated journey following Leon's heels, and part of that is certainly to praise the Capcom developers who have endeavored to make a better value than that, and you could be cynical and look at the DLC and go, I already played this game in Resident Evil 4, but Separate Ways' answer to that is, you may have played this area, but not like this. But I have to ask, is that considered padding for length? I mean, if it lasts 4 hours by technically repeating content, what's the difference between that and any number of time attack or score-based DLC modes? Well, that's up to the individual perspective, but I'd say both the quality of Separate Ways and the way it fits into Resident Evil 4. It does come in at double the time of the last Resident Evil series DLC, Shadows of Rose, and it does entirely reuse large environments, sometimes multiple times over. But it also fills those familiar areas with new bosses, challenges, and important bits of narrative context. So if someone were to say they just recycled assets to pad its length, I'd say, yeah, maybe, but it slaps as much as the main game, so why complain? The quality is there, which is one thing that also separates it from something like Reverse. By primarily reusing assets to not only recontextualize areas for Ada's experience, but also recycling assets to expand on old maps, Separate Ways also, and probably most importantly, manages to feel in lockstep with the main game. One of my biggest problems with DLC campaigns has always been how divergent they feel from the main campaign, focusing on side characters you were never curious about, or offering silly non-canon diversions for a few hours. Or even worse, when DLC are made of pieces that feel essential to the main game, that seem like they were chipped off to be sold later, like the missing chapter in Assassin's Creed 2, or the final chapters of Prince of Persia 2008, or Asura's Wrath. But Resident Evil 4 Remake was a complete package, making Separate Ways feel like a true old-school style expansion in some ways. That's why they're called expansions. It was the whole point of older downloadable content like Oblivion's Shivering Isles, to expand the base game with new, complementary experiences. Like I said, this is the ideal DLC. It's more of the same great experience if you want it, and if you partake, it helps to expand the scope and storytelling of the original game. Yet you'll never feel it missing if you only play the Resident Evil 4 campaign and never touch Ada's story. Polish factors help keep it from feeling like an asset flip. Well-animated cutscenes, fully reworked areas blocked off and shifted, made less familiar than the main campaign, slight new environments inserted into familiar areas, weather effects changing how places look, and arenas repurposed for different enemies and bosses. And all of these elements have been run through Capcom's high bar of quality for recent Resident Evil releases. But that doesn't hide that this, like many modern RE games, is reusing assets, reusing entire areas, perhaps more than any other Resident Evil title or DLC, RE-verse notwithstanding. But unlike something like RE-verse, this DLC plays to the strength of those areas. It innovates on them, makes them work as proper Resident Evil experiences. It's not taking those assets and trying to turn them into an entirely different game that nobody asked for. And as a result, Separate Ways is the kind of DLC everybody should be asking for from now on. For a reasonable price, you get an engaging addition to one of the year's best games, with all the slick presentation and gameplay that entails. And while the relatively affordable price point is worth mentioning on its own, it's more notable for how much you get for your buck here. As someone who recently dipped into the Tiny Tina's Wonderland Season Pass on sale, just to find a series of 4 20-minute levels the developer expected to replay over and over again that were originally priced at $10 a piece, I can attest that bad excuses for single-player DLCs still happen, even if the scourge of Season Passes isn't what it once was. Separate Ways also sidesteps pitfalls like feeling unnecessary, feeling like a half-baked regurgitation that adds nothing new to the RE4 package. It's tightly paced, hefty, satisfying, and polished. And it does all of these things by reusing assets, by relying heavily on a practice that is often derided by fans and critics. Because like anything in art and design, any tool can be used well if you know how to use it. The development team is certainly due their credit for what they've accomplished here, but more people in the industry should take notice. Better expansions to games are possible. Separate Ways proves that, and it didn't need an overpriced season pass, endless downloadable skins, or replayable side modes to be one of the best DLCs in years, and worth every penny. Hello darlings, and thank you very much for watching. As you may know if you follow my social media or streaming, I am taking a slight break from political content to focus mostly on horror video games for the month of October. As a result, I have a lot of fun projects I am currently working on, including a long time in development Silent Hill 3 video essay that I'm hoping to get done by the end of the month, a video on Darkstalkers, a fully horror game shooter ranking video, and a couple other video essays, including one coming very soon on Shadows of the Damned. And I'm very excited for everybody to see them, and I hope you look forward to them as well. Seeing as how Separate Ways just released, this essay just kinda came out of me. It's gonna be a smaller and more fun side offshoot one, and I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it valuable. And if you did, if you enjoyed this or any of my other content, please don't forget to like and subscribe, because I do this as a job now and I need all the engagement I can get, especially on these smaller gaming videos that do not make nearly as much money as my political content. That being said, if you enjoyed this, please also be sure to go follow me on twitch.tv/deaddomain, as I stream there every week, and I'm streaming a lot of horror games through October. And also, don't forget to check out the links down below if you want to throw a few bucks my way, or check out Patreon, where you can get looks at videos like this one before they're made, and be listed as a wonderful Patreon producer here. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you stay tuned and look forward to all of my upcoming content, and have a great rest of your day and a wonderful Halloween season.